All right, welcome back to another episode of Navigating Adulthood in IDD. Today I'm so excited to talk with Joanna Holden, who is the co-founder of Primitive Reflex Integration Plus. Welcome, Joanna.
Why, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
I'm so excited to talk today. So to start, would you mind giving us a short introduction?
Not at all. So my wife and I founded a business called Primitive Reflex Integration Plus, or as we call it, PRI Plus. It's easier to remember. We work with families who have a child with behavior or sensory issues. We help them overcome those challenges, and we realize that they're unique to each child and each family so that the family can thrive and the child can really feel comfortable in his or her own body as they learn and grow.
Awesome. So some listeners might not know, and I feel like I had a small understanding before I met you, and we've talked off the podcast before a couple different times networking. And I feel like from school I knew a little bit, so I think it'd be really beneficial for listeners. What are primitive reflex? What is primitive reflex integration?
That's a great question. So primitive reflexes, there are many, but I look at 8 big ones. So let's start with what is a reflex. A reflex is an involuntary response to some sort of stimulus, right? If you reach out and touch your hand like to a hot stove, you pull away without having to think about it. If you had to think about it, you'd be burned before you pulled your hand away, right? There's another reflex, and I'm drawing a blank on what it's called. If you step on something sharp like a nail, the foot that stepped on the nail automatically bends and the other foot automatically straightens for you to take your weight off the foot that has the nail in it. Isn't that bizarre?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you don't
have to think about it.
Exactly. Yeah. It's totally involuntary. That's the whole point. So these 8 reflexes I look at, the primitive ones, they're called primitive or infantile because they're formed either in utero or shortly after birth. And they each have a purpose. And that's the whole thing. They have a purpose and they are supposed to integrate. They're supposed to go away or go dormant at a certain point, and each has its own different point to go away. Once it goes dormant, the higher centers of the brain can follow the typical development pattern that comes after that.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. What would be like an example of a primitive reflex?
An example is when you touch a newborn baby's hand, you know what they do?
They close, right?
They grab it. Yes. So that's called the palmar grasp reflex. You want a baby to do that when they're newborn. It's a safety defense. It's a mechanism to an involuntary response to hold on when they're not feeling safe or when something touches their hand. So that's normal. It's supposed to happen until about 4 or 5 months. And at that time, if everything goes according to the brain schedule, and that can, be for whatever reason, that reflex goes away. And so that involuntary grasp mechanism goes away. And then that baby learns to grasp and let go voluntarily. And first is grasping voluntarily, then is letting go voluntarily. And then once those 2 things happen, then comes the more mature pincher grasp. And that's how we develop being able to hold a pen or pencil to write. That's how we develop the motor skill. It is a motor skill to be able to hold a spoon or a fork or a knife.
Right.
Or anything in our hands, basically.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. And yeah, you've really expanded on like why they're important. They're this primitive reflex that's developed for babies, like
right. Yeah.
For what they need in that moment. Because grabbing a caregiver, that's very like attachment, like theory and a healthy attachment.
Right.
And it makes sense why they do that. And I'm familiar with your work, so we'll kind of lead more into it. But it's, what happens if somebody doesn't, if it doesn't go away?
That's another great question. So that's a big deal. And that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for those kiddos whose behavior and sensory issues show me that the reflexes haven't gone away. And then I test for them just to make sure. Just to give you another example is called the spinal galant reflex. And if you stroke a baby's back on one side when they're little infants, they'll flex their hip to that same side. And if you touch their back on the other side, they'll flex their hip to the other side. So the purpose of that is to wiggle their way through the birth canal. Wow. And I just think that's ingenious. Right. So it has a cool purpose. Now, that's supposed to go away when they wiggle their way through the birth canal. Now, it's not immediate. It goes away in early months. If it doesn't go away, though, when you have someone in later years, it can be child or adulthood, but mostly it's childhood for this one in particular. something touches their back and they feel ticklish or they get wiggly. So it's kiddos who feel like they have ants in their pants. They can't sit still, or kids who are particularly picky about what pants or waistbands they'll wear. Clothing might bother them. The tags on their shirt might bother them. Anything that touches their back is going to cause some degree of movement that they can't control. And they don't even know that it's happening.
Right. It's
so
like
then
a very sensory, it's
exactly.
like when those sensory issues happen, this could be one of the reasons why they're having trouble with that sensory integration.
Exactly. And so you get that kiddo who just, random made up example. You get the kiddo who's told to sit in his chair in this classroom. He sits in his chair, it tickles, so he knocks the chair over on purpose. Well, then he picks the chair up and throws it, and then he gets sent to the principal's office. Well, he doesn't realize that he just couldn't sit in that chair because he was wiggly. Right. So he gets the class laughing, he gets the teacher's attention, he gets all of this stuff, this emotional stuff going, when if we can just integrate that reflex so his back doesn't tickle anymore when he sits down, then his learning and his behavior will change.
Right, because and he's probably not aware, and in a situation like, oh, I was tickled by this chair.
Nope, he felt uncomfortable sitting in the chair.
It's like an uncomfortable response.
Right.
Do we know why primitive reflexes don't go away, or is that something that's still being studied?
That is the big question. There are a couple of things that are definite causes of primitive reflexes to not integrate. One is trauma. And that is the big overarching umbrella of a lot of things that could be explained. That can be trauma during pregnancy, trauma during birth, trauma in infancy. And trauma doesn't mean, massive car accident. Trauma can be real or imagined. So it can be anything from neglect, abuse, not enough tummy time. It can also be anything environmental. So an allergy, anything like that. And here's the most bizarre thing, and this really ties into your perspective with adults with intellectual disabilities. There is some research that shows that adults with Alzheimer's and dementia, some of those primitive reflexes pop back up.
Oh, wow.
Isn't that weird? So the research that I read shows that they can integrate the reflexes and increase their quality of life for up to 5 years. Now, it doesn't get rid of the dementia or the Alzheimer's by any means, but it improves their quality of life while they do still have a quality of life potential.
Right. Oh, that's so interesting. It comes back sometimes. Yeah. Oh, wow.
I recently met with a man who was, a military veteran, at least 3 tours in Iraq, I believe. And we checked his reflexes, and he had the 3 big ones: the Moreau reflex, the asymmetrical tonic neck reflex, or ATNR, and tonic labyrinth neck reflex. And those are the 3 biggest, and those are impacting his daily life. And a lot of that is probably related to the trauma with military service. Right. In a nutshell.
Oh, that's so interesting. And what I have read and understand about trauma too is with some of the kiddos I work with that have a lot of like sensory overstimulation or difficulties just with different sensory stimulation, is like that can cause trauma too. So it's almost like this cycle where it's like the seat's making me uncomfortable, and it's like a physical trauma, and then the brain remembers it, and it just kind of builds on itself.
Exactly. Yes. And you just described some examples of what's called the Moreau reflex when it's not integrated. So I'll go into that a little bit if you don't mind.
I would go for it.
Because for me, that's the biggie. I found that once the Moreau reflex is integrated, it runs the show. So once it gets integrated, the rest kind of follow suit. But that one it's the big blocker. So the Moreau reflex is the precursor to the adult startled reflex. So as an adult, if you're driving down the street, you hear a loud noise, you think, oh, what is that? You look in your rearview mirror and you see it's an ambulance. So what you heard was the siren. What you see is the lights on the ambulance. You pull over, get out of the way, wait for it to pass, and then you get back on the road again. Well, adults who sometimes hit the ceiling when that happens.
Right.
Or get super startled. Well, they may have their Moreau reflex still intact. Now, you're supposed to be startled enough to do something if necessary. You want your body to be able to react when a bear is chasing you.
Right. Yes.
No, you don't want that reaction all of the time, though. So that goes back to the Moreau reflex. When you tip a baby on their tummy, well, let me back up a step. So a baby has been warm, fed, protected, ideally, and shielded from most external stimuli while they're in the womb. So all of a sudden they're born and they're exposed to so many things that they haven't been exposed to before. So they need a way of getting attention when they feel scared or needing attention. So if you tip a baby on their tummy fast without supporting their head, or if you flash a bright light in their eyes or make a loud sound like a clap, they will flail their arms and legs over, their face flushes, their eyes dilate, they go, huge breath in, and then they curl back in, and as they curl in, they let out a wail. Ah! Okay, that's not my best wail, but that's,
For the podcast listeners, we toned it down.
That is their baby's way of getting attention when they feel danger. You want that to be there. You really want that to be there for a time.
Right.
What that does is first of all, it gets attention if they feel like they need it. So, that scream draws adult attention or anybody's attention. And it turns on their fight or flight. It turns on that sympathetic nervous system to say, hey, I need something. My body needs something. And that is supposed to go away. If it doesn't go away, that body is always in fight or flight. It's always in fight, flight, flee, fight, flee, or free. I've heard it described lots of different ways, but that sympathetic nervous system is always on, and it doesn't know how to turn itself off. Think of the amount of cortisol that's always being produced then. Yeah. Think of the amount of heightened nervousness, heightened senses. So those people are going to be overly sensitive to, like, they'll be able to hear the sound of fluorescent lights. And they'll be super sensitive to anything that touches them. They might crave deep touch and hugs. They might be super reluctant to be touched, hugged. It might surprise them when somebody taps them on the shoulder more than one would normally be surprised. They may be averse to smells, tastes. Anything sensory related will help them not feel safe. And so integrating that primitive reflex tells that nervous system that it doesn't always need to be in fight or flight. And I have integrated this for a couple of adults, and what they have told me before is it's like, one of them said it's like turning the dial on a radio from it being static to being on a station.
Oh, wow.
One said the greens are greener, the blues are bluer. And one said it's a calmness that she's never experienced before. She didn't always have to be in control.
Wow. Well, yeah, and for adults, that's how they experience their whole life.
For sure.
Probably not even knowing that there is another kind of way to not be overstimulated.
Exactly. Yeah. And so as adults, we learn to compensate. We find ways to avoid crowds if crowds bother us. We find ways to avoid loud noises. We do lots of things to compensate to make ourselves feel comfortable. Kids don't necessarily have those means.
Right.
And so they end up being, the bad kid, the kid who's in trouble, the kid who's, bothering somebody else or talking too much or not talking enough. It could go either way.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, that's awesome.
Mm-hmm. Can I tell you a story?
Of course.
So I'm working with a kiddo right now, and his Moreau, so the reflexes are judged on a scale of 0 to 4. His Moreau was a 4 to start with. We've had 4 sessions, and already his grandparents saw him for the first time in a while, and they already noticed a massive difference in him. He's a 10-year-old boy, and he was at the dinner table with some older cousins, and he actually participated in the conversation in a meaningful way. Mom said that he started to interrupt, and he stopped himself from interrupting and participated in a way that made sense. And the grandparents noticed this and said that, normally he wouldn't have said anything. He would have just sat there all by himself. Yeah. So in 4 sessions already. Yeah. It's that making that kind of an impact on one kiddo.
Right. So what do your services look like? I think we've touched a lot on why it's important and kind of, what it is, how reflexes sometimes don't go away. And then that can cause a lot of barriers later in life. So yeah, what does that look like in your work? How do you integrate?
Yes. So the reflexes, all you need to do is a certain specific exercise for each reflex to get it to go away. You need to do it repeatedly. So 3 to 5 times a day, 10 to 15 reps in each time for up to 6 months. Wow. Usually it's at least 6 months, depending on the severity of the reflex. I have sort of something that makes us different. I use cold laser technology. So mine looks just like a flashlight. I shine it at the brainstem where the reflexes are housed while the child does the exercises. And that's like, it's cold laser, so there's no heat involved. Sometimes the kids say they can feel it, but they can't. It's like a cat toy,
right?
A laser. However, it is calibrated specifically to the same frequency that our DNA communicates with our cells. So what it does is it doesn't do anything to healthy cells. It just tells the dead and dying cells, go on out. We don't need you anymore. So new cells come in. And as the new cells are coming in, they learn the exercise the right way.
Awesome.
So that makes the reflex go away. So typically I can get those reflexes to go away in 4 to 6 visits. So our services, in addition to that, include, we have four pillars in our service. One is integrating those primitive reflexes. And that really is the start of what I do, because nothing else is going to make a whole lot of difference until those reflexes are gone. The second is called hemispheric balance. So as the brain grows and develops, and this could be its own podcast,
right?
As the brain grows and develops, the right side develops, then the left, then the right hemisphere, then the left hemisphere. More often than not, one side gets stronger than the other, and it tends to take over and dominate. So that weaker side, while it's still there, it's just not able to do as much as it could or should be doing because the dominant side is taking over. And that's well and good. In adults, we, like I said before, we find ways to compensate. We find a job that suits our needs and our personality. In kiddos, that's not always possible, though. So it's like having I'm going to date myself here, an old Atari gaming system with the latest PS4.
Maybe five.
Yes.
I hope that's right.
I don't know. So they're both fully functional, but they can't talk to each other very well. And the importance of that is you need both sides of your brain to do things like a math word problem. The right side extrapolates the important information, sends it over to the left side to do those calculations. The left side sends it back to the right side, and the right side spits out the answer. If those two sides aren't working well together and aren't communicating well together, it's going to make that kind of thing very difficult. And that's real world. Word problems are real world. Like when you're at the grocery store trying to decide which granola bars to buy, which one is more cost effective. You need that's a math problem in a nutshell. So what I do is specific exercises and sensory stimulation to get that weak side stronger so that the two sides can communicate better.
Awesome.
And that's all exercise and sensory stimulation. The third pillar is nutrition and supplementation. It's not my specialty, but I do know that it's important. So I don't ask a family to go on a specific diet. It's too much at the same time as what I'm doing. But what I do ask is that they take two specific supplements, a digestive enzyme and a glutathione formula. And then I have them log the child's daily food intake. And what I'm looking for is any kind of correlation between what the child is eating and their behaviors. One example I found is I had a 6-year-old boy, and anytime he ate, they called them meat sticks. It was like the beef jerky stick.
Yeah.
They got him. Yes.
Slim Jim or something.
Slim Jim. They got him on a discounted, massive, huge box at Costco. Anytime he ate one of those, the next day his behavior was poor. And so it was neat to be able to say, okay, let's try skipping that for a snack and then seeing if his behavior changes. And it was helpful.
Awesome.
Yeah. The last pillar of our system is parent support. We do parent coaching, and that is just vital. I've not found it in any other program that I've seen, but we do parent coaching once a week during the entirety of the program to give the parents the support, tips, tricks, and tools that they might need to help their child and support their child and adjust their family dynamics if necessary during the program. And then afterwards, if they want more.
Oh, that's great. I feel like that's such an important piece of the puzzle, because it's like you can do the exercises and the lasers, and yeah, that's going to be beneficial. But what happens when they go home? Did they they keep practicing? Are they eating okay? Yeah, and there's so much that can happen at home that we don't have control over as clinicians. So I think that's a great support for parents too, because things
very
can
much
be
so
overwhelming.
Yes. And I've heard so many good things. My parent coach is amazing. I have two parent coaches. One is more active than the other and with our clients. And I've just heard great things. And, we communicate regularly. So I know what I'm focusing on with the child during their sessions. And then she knows, if a child brings something up with me, I can let her know to discuss with the parents.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And so once these reflexes are integrated, do you find that becomes like a lifelong change?
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes sense.
The thing that would trigger it again is trauma.
Right. And or Alzheimer's, right? So
yes, exactly. Yeah. Any kind of trauma, real or perceived. An example of that is abuse, or even okay, I'll give you an example. I worked with a 6-year-old kiddo whose parents were in the middle of a nasty divorce, and he was doing fantastically. His reflexes were integrating, and anytime he went to visit dad, I can't say there was abuse. I don't know that there was abuse, but there was definitely, dad was an intimidating personality.
Right.
And anytime the kiddo came back to me after a weekend with dad, his reflex, one particular reflex was back intact.
Right.
And that reflex correlates with bedwetting after 5.
Mm-hmm.
And he wet the bed every time he came back from dad's house. And that reflex was popped. And as soon as we got it back down, he would go to dad's again, 2 weeks later. So that's just one example.
Right. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. That's an external stimulus that I can't control. And obviously he can't control.
Right.
But until that trauma in his mind goes away and he realizes, either gets out of the dangerous situation or realizes it's not a dangerous situation, the reflex will continue to pop back up.
Right. Have you ever read The Body Keeps the Score?
No.
Oh, here, I actually have it. So The Body Keeps the Score by, I hope I say this right, Bessel van der Kolk.
Okay. I've heard the name.
Yeah. I mean, it's about essentially, the title is saying that he just did a lot of work with like trauma and PTSD and really, discusses kind of like where talk therapy works, where medicine works, but then where he has found in his work that so much healing is in the body. And you have to like physically kind of do something to get rid of trauma. And I feel like it aligns so much with this kind of sensory trauma, or even these reflexes that are happening because of trauma, where it's like you could talk this out with the kid. It doesn't make any sense, but you are reflexing and you don't need to be, but and that's not going to do anything.
No, it's an involuntary thing.
Right. And so all that kind of movement and exercises that you really have in your work, I think makes so much sense from this book and what I've been reading about.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's such a good resource. And he barely touches on music, like dance kind of therapy is more what he's familiar with. But I see that too with like what I do with sensory stuff. It's like we can provide that physical kind of intervention.
Right.
We're logically things aren't going to make it better.
No, and it's an opportunity for the body to re-experience or re-experiencing something that in a different way.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, because talking is not going to help in this case. No,
you can't rationalize with a 2 or 3-year-old.
Right.
Right.
And then even if you could, like you're saying, it's involuntary. So
right.
It has to be this kind of very movement-based intervention, which I think is so cool.
Another point I think that is important to make is that it also has to be fun.
Right.
And music for sure brings that element of fun. And, I have to come up with games and ways of having these kids do these exercises that make them want to come back.
Right. Yeah. Because if it was just like, do this over and over, maybe an adult would be able to. But again, you can kind of rationalize a little more with somebody older. But it's just going to be a lot more motivating when you can incorporate games or songs or stories.
Yes.
Or anything where it's like, I want to come back and do that again.
Yep.
Because then it's also just making it a positive experience all around. So not only, I feel like, especially with this reflex work, not only are they working to integrate and get rid of the primitive reflex, but then it's this very positive experience. It's like, oh, not only, can I do new skills, but it was fun getting there.
Right. Yeah. I make it a challenge, but not too challenging.
Right. Well, in music therapy, I feel like a lot of times we like talk about almost like tricking a client. I don't know if I quite like those words exactly, but a lot of times they might not be aware of the work too much. I try to communicate my goals with my clients, so I'm not like, I don't want it to be deceptive, but it is like where it's challenging but fun, and finding that balance.
Right.
Cool. And I can see that overlap in your work too.
For sure. Definitely.
Awesome. And I know we've been talking a lot about kids. I think that makes sense with this topic, just because that's where you're going to see a lot more. But you've had some great examples of when it continues for adults and working with adults. I did find a quote on your website that I will read if you don't mind.
Not at all.
You have like different questions for potential clients to work with. And one was, do you worry your child will always need you and will never be able to live a full and independent life? And I really thought that connected back to adults specifically.
Right.
So how does your work lead to this independence so that adults down the road can have that full life that you kind of described?
Good question. Now, inhibiting the primitive reflex isn't going to solve all the problems. But what it's going to do is allow that barrier and that blocker to be gone. And I'll give you a great example. So with that palmar grasp reflex, and one of the potential symptoms for the reflex not going away is messy handwriting, because a child holds a pen or pencil funny or doesn't have control of the pen or pencil because it tickles their hand. So I can get rid of the reflex so that the reflex goes away and they can hold a pen or pencil however they want to. Now, there's going to be a habit of holding it the old way, and it's not going to fix the handwriting. So I had a 16-year-old boy that I worked with, and he wanted to improve his handwriting. So we were doing the exercises to get rid of the primitive reflex, and that worked fine. The reflex went away, but he had to also practice. I gave him a white marker board to practice his handwriting. Now, I don't know if he actually did that or not. It was sort of a homework, and I didn't really check it because it was sort of out of my scope of what I do. But after the program, he told me he lived with his grandmother, and his grandmother was hoping to get him some of these independent life skills, and that was one of her goals for him. But he told me that she made him go to a birthday party that he did not want to go to. It was a family party, and of course he got gifts, and he just didn't want to go. But he went, and after the party, Grandma had him write out thank you notes for the gifts that he received. And he told me, Joanna, that was the first time in my life on a blank card that I wrote in a straight line across the card. Wow.
Right.
I never worked on that with him.
Right.
I didn't do that. I didn't focus on that. But he was able to do that because of the reflex being integrated.
Right.
So it's like that with all of those reflexes. It's not necessarily going to provide the end result. There's going to be work in between to get toward independence. But when you're out of fight or flight, or when you're able to cross the midline with your eyes for the first time in your life, it's going to make a huge difference in how you're able to present yourself, control your body, and your perception of the world changes. So that can lead to more independence.
Definitely. It's that kind of base goal that has to happen for other things to flourish.
Exactly. It's really foundational.
I had a podcast episode with Amanda Brigham, who's a music therapist in the Denver area. And she does all these talks on design thinking, which, I mean, that is a whole other episode, actually. And it has a lot of principles. And one of it is like finding the real problem. Because if you're working on something in music therapy specifically, but there's something else going on, that's never you're just kind of, it might improve like for a short period of time, but long term you might feel like, well, why isn't this improving? And I feel like something like a primitive reflex would be that real problem, or any kind of sensory thing is what I like to address first. Because if you're overstimulated in the world, if you're in fight or flight constantly, and somebody's trying to get you to, speak in a full sentence, like for example,
right?
How,
It's not the priority.
Right.
It can't be the priority.
It can't be the priority. You might be able to achieve it, but you might be making it more work than it needs to be, because that priority, that real goal, finding kind of the root of things and helping that first is what will lead then, like you're saying, to that future work of different areas. But you kind of have to address what's necessary first.
Definitely. I call that the bottom up approach versus a top down approach.
And I think she might have used that too.
Oh,
so
okay.
Thank you for using the actual term.
Yes. So an OT, for example, will work with the kiddo who's not holding the pen or pencil correctly. He or she might do exercises with the kiddo to get that hand more stable. They might teach them to hold the paper and brace their body with one arm to stabilize themselves. They might add, I don't know that there's a name for, I don't know the name of them. It's like a thing that goes on the end of the pen or pencil to hold the child's fingers still in the correct position. Do you know what I mean? I can't think of the name.
I don't know what it's called.
Yeah, I don't either. So that's a top-down approach, in my opinion. So what I'm doing is I am inhibiting that primitive reflex that makes the hand not want to do that.
Right.
So that then they can hold a pen or pencil correctly. So it's getting rid of that root problem. It's really getting to the core issue.
Right. Yeah.
Like you're saying. Yes.
I just wanted to kind of highlight that because I feel like you're doing very important work.
Thank you.
Where it's getting to those root problems.
Right.
So yeah, it can lead to that more independent life down the road.
Definitely.
Yeah. And you've said you did work with adults, and that's great, but at the same time we discussed, like, they've had their whole life like in fight or flight, and like it's so good that they can continue without with the reflex inhibited, but it's also like, oh, that time where they've been in fight or flight, that's a lot of time.
It is. It's almost time lost, but at the same time there's you can't change the past.
Right.
You just have to go with where you are now.
It's so true.
Yeah.
Awesome, Joanna. Well, I think we're kind of winding down. Is there anything else you'd like to share with us and the listeners?
Well, the first step for if PRI Plus is a good fit is to have a free call with me. It's generally about a 30-minute consultation call. And then the next step after that is to actually see, it's an evaluation for the child to see if there are primitive reflexes present. With that step is also a free report. I call it the results and recommendations report. And by that time, the parents will have met with my parent coach, and my parent coach and I will come up with a game plan for the child and the family and see if they're a good fit for us and we're a good fit for them. And anybody that's generally $249. And we put a lot of work into that. It's a very, very generous offer, in my opinion. However, anybody who calls and says that they've heard about PRI Plus from your podcast today, I will offer them a free evaluation.
Oh, awesome.
So free consult call and then a free evaluation.
Oh, great. Just mention navigating adulthood in IDD.
Exactly.
Cool. And where can listeners find out more about a PRI Plus and kind of contact you?
Our phone number is 720-295-5788. And our website is www.pri-plus.com.
Awesome. And we'll make sure those are in the show notes. I'll put The Body Keeps the Score.
Perfect.
And you sent me an awesome handout that I'll make sure people have access to.
Yes. So what that handout is it lists all of the primitive reflexes that I check for that are all 8 of them. It says what the purpose is, I believe. And then it also lists the potential symptoms of retention if that reflex hasn't gone away.
Awesome. So we'll make sure that's in the show notes and all of your awesome information.
Okay.
Yeah. I am so excited to share this with everybody. Yeah, and thanks for coming on today.
My pleasure. My goal is to help as many kiddos and families as I can. So I really appreciate your helping get the word out, and let's help families together.
Sounds good. Awesome. Thanks, Joanna.
Thanks, Bonnie.
Wasn't that a great conversation with Joanna? I loved all of the information she shared. I thought it was a very articulate, informative conversation with a lot of really good takeaway resources, and including the handout in the show notes. Please check that out. I think as clinicians, it's good to keep learning and to keep being lifelong learners. So even if you're working with adults, to recognize these primitive reflexes could be crucial if that is what your adult is still experiencing. Kind of the ties to trauma that we discussed as well, I think can be the root of the different sensory issues and sensory overstimulation and understimulation that we see in our adults with disabilities. We can kind of recognize where that comes from. And then a lot of, not necessarily all of us work with just adults, so seeing that in kids as well, and just recognizing that importance of sensory integration and the primitive reflex integration and the awesome work that Joanna's doing. So I think that learning is a great takeaway from this episode. We also discussed the importance of movement in any kind of trauma work, whether that's sensory trauma or trauma caused by big trauma situations like abuse or neglect, or accidents like a car accident as discussed. Just recognizing that while there is a place for talk therapy and while that can help people with different problems in their lives for things like reflexes, like sensory issues, it's this movement-based therapy that has to be incorporated to help our clients get the best results and to kind of move through the trauma and heal through movement, which we can see in the primitive reflex work, which we can see in music therapy and dance therapy. And incorporating that movement can be crucial when you see these sensory needs of our clients, whether they're adults or children. So please take a look at the resources, and if you're interested in Joanna's work, please check out her website and contact her for services. If you're in the Denver area, she's doing amazing work and really important work getting to that root problem. And as therapists, acknowledging a root problem or discovering a root problem could be really important in our work too. And I thought that part of the discussion was important. So check out Joanna, check out the handout that she shared with us and the other resources in the show notes. And I hope, again, that you really enjoyed that conversation as much as I did, just continuing to solidify things I know and then learn more, too, about reflexes so that I can be informed if I see that situation and then, just make that professional decision. Is it in my scope where I can address this, or do I need to refer to an OT or refer to Joanna? I think that can be a really important awareness for us as therapists too. So yeah, next we'll move in the music therapy session plan for adults with IDD for August.
All right. This month we have the August music therapy session plan for adults with IDD, which includes the Hello song, Oh What a Beautiful Morning from Oklahoma, then drumming with some summer visuals, which are available on Patreon. Next is, of course, an original song I wrote about emotions. Then, continuing the emotional theme, there is a coping skills improv that I created. Ending with Goodbye, Aloha, Oi. This outline and its breakdown are accessible to Patreon patrons on patreon.com/navigating adulthood and IDD for $5 a month. For $5 a month, you get a monthly music therapy session plan, its breakdown, its visuals, its lead sheets, as well as access to our Facebook community, our monthly Zoom community call, and every previous session plan and ad-free episodes of this podcast 1 week early. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, come check it out. It's $5 a month on patreon.com/navigating adulthood and IDD. Other ways to support this podcast include continuing to watch and download it, rating it on iTunes, sharing it with a friend, following when new episodes come out on Instagram at Navigating Adulthood and IDD, and just continuing to listen. Your support is so appreciated. Thank you so much for listening today. I will catch you in the next one. This podcast is by Rhythmic Roots Music Services, LLC, with content and music produced by Bonnie Haupt. Thanks for listening.